Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the seminar, and I will kick off. My name is Anders Karp. I'm Deputy CEO of Saab, and we're very honored to host this session, which will be extremely interesting to learn more about experiences. And now listening, of course, to the world's best fighter. So the timing was a bit wrong, but now we got it. We're going to listen to a very interesting speeches about the insights and learnings of the war in Ukraine so far. We have two of the world's top best in that area. And we also have Sweden's best moderator to run this, Katarina Tracz, who will very soon will start. But we're also extremely pleased and honored by the presence of the ambassador, His Excellency Andriy Plakoniuk, to have you here in the room. And please stand up and receive the applause.
Dear Anders, dear friends, I'm really profoundly honored to be here together with my colleagues from the embassy. It's so important that the issues of security, the issues of the future activities of the defense industries, which lessons can be drawn from the Ukraine's war for freedom and dignity, how it can be translated into new reality. It's absolutely important and fantastic. And I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Good and frank questions and answers. And definitely, which is equally important, to have good practical deliverables that can be presented, put on the table for the decision makers to make their policy, to update their policy, and to make necessary decisions for the benefit of Sweden and all our friends abroad. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So with that, I hand over to Ms. Katarina Tracz.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Anders, for that very kind introduction. And I wish that all the seminars I started were, open with an overflight, just as the one we hear now. But nice timing, though. Welcome, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, to this seminar hosted by Saab, titled New Insights and Lessons Learned from Ukraine. How can Sweden contribute to NATO? As Anders Karp mentioned, we have two very prominent experts with us here today to discuss the issue. We have Professor Justin Bronk, who's a senior research fellow at RUSI in London. Very welcome to you. Please, you could come up. And we have Dr. Oscar Jonsson, who is a researcher at the Swedish Defence University. Please, Oscar. And we will start having a discussion between us soon. But first, I'd like to hear the opening introductions from you and your perspective. So please, Justin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And my apologies for not being able to speak to you in Swedish. Believe me, I speak French. But as a Brit, I'm told by many French colleagues to please not. Their language is quite precious. So I can only imagine what damage I do to Swedish. But yeah, so in terms of the lessons that I would see from Ukraine, in terms of what we know of the Russian military now, essentially, in broad brush terms, there is a narrative that the Russian military has fallen flat, that its doctrine is totally outdated, that its equipment is massively inferior to Western equipment. And from what I've seen in Ukraine and from what my colleagues have seen from taking apart Russian captured equipment, for example, with Ukrainian specialists, that is just simply not the case. What is the case is that Russian doctrine and Russian equipment works fairly well when it is able to be used as it was intended to be used. And when there is any ability to force the Russians to adapt, to do things differently from what they intended, or when they simply, through bad planning, and bad political military coordination do things that are outside their doctrine and expect their military to adapt, then it falls apart. But their equipment generally works just fine. It's the majority of the same equipment Ukraine has used so successfully to defend itself. For example, in the air domain, Ukraine started the war with the largest air defense system in Europe in terms of numbers of launchers, numbers of assets, radars, trained personnel. And actually, it defended its skies primarily with its own Ukrainian, Soviet-made, Ukrainian upgraded equipment for the first 6 months of the war before Western air defense equipment started to arrive in any scale. So, I think we should be wary of taking lessons away that Western kit is somehow dramatically superior to Russian stuff. And we should also remember how lucky Ukraine has been, how lucky we have been, that the Russians started the war with an insane plan based on false assumptions and then tried to operate completely outside their doctrine. Briefly, when they were able to operate roughly as their doctrine intends, albeit having lost many of their spearhead and elite units early on in the war, but when they were operating as their doctrine intended in June and July last year in Donbass, the Ukrainian armed forces had an incredibly difficult time of it. So, do not write off the Russians both in Ukraine now and going forward as a military threat. Also, we are talking about lessons here. This is the purpose of the session, as I understand. But of course, the Russians are learning direct lessons. The Russians today are not the same force that they were when they invaded Ukraine as a full-scale invasion in February last year. They have continued to adapt. They have continued to improve. Thank goodness, much slower than we would, much slower than the Ukrainian forces have. But they continue to get better. They continue to learn lessons, and that will go on over time. So right now, the only thing I can see that could actually lose Ukraine the war is if they are unable to keep the Russian Air Force out of their skies on their sides of the front lines. For now, Ukraine has been able to keep the VKS, the Russian Aerospace Forces, broadly irrelevant. They are restricted to essentially long-range bombardment with cruise missiles, with glided bombs, and so they can hit fixed targets. That's always been the case, but they can't hit enough fixed targets to have a strategically vital or strategically decisive effect, and they can't do battlefield close air support and interdiction against moving or organic targets on the Ukrainian side of the lines the way that we associate with air power. So one of the lessons for us in terms of supporting Ukraine would be we need to keep it that way. We need to keep the Russian aerospace forces back. And so that is both keeping supplies of ammunition and new systems in terms of launchers for the ground-based air defenses, and also, if possible, a working fighter solution to provide a backstop. I imagine there may be some questions on that. I won't go into it immediately on here. But in terms of broader lessons, however, for the 2 to 3 to 4 year time frame, and what we in NATO and hopefully Sweden soon in NATO as well need to do to keep the Russian threat at bay. First of all, however this war shakes out in terms of the current counteroffensive going into next year potentially, Ukraine will continue to need large-scale support in terms of equipment, ammunition, restructuring, reconstruction, economic support, but also Russia will continue to rebuild its military. The Russian arms industry has been put finally on a war footing. Again, we're very lucky they didn't try to do that until the back end of last year, until it was really clear to them with the Kharkiv and the Kherson offensives how badly they were losing, that this was going to be a long war. They started putting their industry on a war footing. But towards the end of this year, we will already see significant increases in Russian production. They were very low on ammunition at the beginning of their own offensives in the spring. And they're still struggling. But if you look, for example, at ammunition production, Russia produced about 1.5 million shells last year. It's on course to produce about 2.5 this year, and its target is 7 in 3 years' time per year. That sort of production increase is not going to go away. Even if Putin is replaced by Patrushev, by Prigozhin, whoever it might be that eventually replaces him, as we saw over the weekend, the internal discussions and struggles in Russia are not about whether to keep up the war or whether to keep up the confrontation more broadly with the West. They're about how to do that. And so broadly, we are likely to have a continued political threat from Russia that could be a military threat if they see an opportunity. And we're likely to see them produce large amounts of ammunition, tanks, aircraft, missiles going forward. They won't be as high quality as they were at the start of the invasion. because we've cut off a lot of the access to components that they need. But again, as we've seen from Ukraine, even a T-62 is still a real problem if there are a lot of them and if you don't have any anti-tank ammunition. So first and foremost, what would I say we need to do in the West? We need to produce ammunition in huge quantities. It's just not sufficient as an approach to pretend that this is all going to blow over. It's not. And the second thing I would flag, aware that I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes. Oh, no, I've still got a little bit. So the second thing I would flag is that the Indo-Pacific is not a separate problem from the Russia threat in the medium term. Because when is Russia most likely to either restart active hostilities against Ukraine if there is some form of ceasefire or if Ukraine manages to take back its borders and establish a pause? Or when is Russia likely to, or most likely to, conduct aggression against the NATO member state in a small scale in order to try and break collective deterrence, to try and break Article 5 and show it's a bluff, which has always been the ultimate goal for them so they can deal with their small neighbors bilaterally rather than through collective deterrence? Well, it's when the US is involved in the Indo-Pacific and can't reinforce us. The main window of vulnerability for a war between the US and China, whether it's over Taiwan, whether it's based off something sparking off in the Korean Peninsula, which, by the way, all the indicators are on red. It's just nobody's paying attention because we have bigger problems close to home. But in the Korean Peninsula, for example, both sides have a military strategy predicated on preemption, whether NBC in the case of the North Koreans or conventional in the case of the South. But neither side talks to each other. So we have no indicators or warnings. We don't understand why the North is doing what it's doing. And South Korean counterforce capabilities go against North Korean nuclear ones, but are not integrated with American nuclear planning, for example. So there are plenty of problems in the Indo-Pacific. And equally, we could have something go off because of, for example, territorial disputes in the South China Sea. The Russians are very likely to use that opportunity if they think they can, to conduct some form of limited demonstrative aggression against us in Europe, either against Ukraine again or against one of us in terms of European NATO members, because they will never get a better opportunity. Because in the 2026 to 2028 timeframe, the Chinese will be ready, is the assessment, to take Taiwan or to try, and the Americans won't be ready with a lot of their technological answers. The Americans, if the Chinese wait until 2029, 2030, there are starting to be some answers to a lot of the higher end capabilities, but it's that 26-28 window. So we need to be prepared to deny the Russians any view in their minds, not in ours, that they could give a short, sharp military victory and demonstration against us in that time period without major American support. Because the Russians won't do anything if they think we have military options. The Russians are opportunistic. They started this war because they thought it would be quick. They thought it would be easy. The same as when they went after Crimea, the same as when they smashed the anti-terror operation in the Donbass in 2015, the same as Georgia, the same as Chechnya. If they think that we have a good chance of stopping them, then they won't do anything. And as we've seen, once a war starts, it doesn't matter if the initial logic is no longer valid. Once a war starts, there is the sunk cost fallacy. Everyone thinks, well, it can't all have been for nothing. Everybody just doubles down and doubles down and doubles down. It is so much cheaper to prevent a war starting than to stop it once it starts. So again, what do we need? Our equipment is good. Our missile systems work. Our training works. Our tactics work. What do we need? More of it. And above all, ammunition, spares, and realistic training, because that's what the Russians count. And deterrence doesn't happen on a PowerPoint slide or in a political presentation for us. Deterrence happens in the mind of your enemy and on their time frame. So if we've got 3 years or so till we need to be ready, that means we need to make the orders now, because it takes 3 years to build anything.
Thank you, Justin. The ambassador asked for specific recommendations, and I believe you had plenty of them. Let me just pick up with a follow-up question on the last part of your introduction. You mentioned that we need to deny Russia a short, quick victory. You mentioned sort of increasing our production. Do you have any other recommendations? How do we do that when it comes to denying Russia this victory?
So we've seen from the fighting that Ukraine has had to endure against the Russians, and so far fairly successfully, We do not want to have to fight like that. And also, we don't have the demographics or the money to build a ground-based military in terms of where the majority of the firepower and the forces are to play Russia at its own game. Our answer has always been air superiority in the West. And we've seen how incredibly effective that model is when it works. Because if you can roll back the enemy's air defenses and then bring in highly capable close air support and battlefield interdiction with 4th or 5th gen air power at scale, then the Russian army would simply evaporate. So the challenge, as far as I can see it, because it's impossible for us to build a military in the time frame with the money that we might have, with the people that we could recruit, that could fight the Russians at their own game without air superiority. Therefore, the only logical conclusion is we have to repair our ability to ensure air superiority over where the Russians might choose to fight us, which is basically in Eastern Europe. And so, what do we need to kill? Well, there's good news. We only need to be able to kill about 200 to 300 targets. That is not a very large number of targets. Those are the mobile, well-protected, well-defended Russian surface-to-air missile systems. Long-range, medium, short-range, as a system. So, you need to invest in weapons that can reach out from a safe degree of standoff. And if you're a stealth aircraft, you can go much closer in, but you still need some standoff. And those weapons need to be able to actively hunt, find, and kill the SAM, not just home in on radar, because when you fire at a SAM from standoff, it will turn off its radar and move. We have weapons like that. GBU-53, the American small diameter bomb 2, Spear 3, which is a Anglo-French dedicated DIAD munition, destruction of enemy air defenses, ARGM-ER, which is a US Navy version that Norway is buying for its F-35s. The thing about these weapons is they're expensive. They are high capability, and therefore going after a very expensive target set. So they make perfect sense if they're for going after that target set. But what you can't do is buy just those and therefore have an economy of scale by saying we're just going to have this couple of weapons types to go after all our missions. Because if you use weapons like that against, people with machine guns on pickup trucks in sandy places, then that's an incredibly inefficient and non-economical way of going about it. So I think it means some air forces will have to specialize in that, because for the militaries that choose to go after that mission set, which we need in Europe, they will have to spend so much money that they will not be able to spend money on mission sets and weapon sets that we currently use for less demanding missions. And that means other allies who do keep doing those things, current close air support, for example, will then have to step up to fill the gap left by the air forces that do go after the high end. We need to work as an alliance together on this stuff.
All right. We'll get back to on how we can do that. But first, Oscar, please let me hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. A lot of good points have already been made, but I would first start making a meta point on lessons learned. And what worries me kind of the most is, are we learning the real lessons, or are we learning some kind of stylized, image-wise, mediated lessons from this war that says, 18 HIMARS system will decisively win this war, or TB2 drones, everyone singing and dancing to the TB2 songs, and that will win the war. I think that, and my points go very much in line with Justin on this one. I think we need to appreciate the scale of this, because this is something vastly different than everything we have been preparing for. Let me take a few examples. Between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine stood up around 25-30 brigades. Sweden got 2. With a little bit of luck, we will have 3.5 soon. Ukraine have around 1,200 artillery systems, according to RUSI data. Sweden got 48, and now we're sending 8 of them away. That means we got around 40. This has by and large been an artillery war. Also, RUSI data says the UK, Europe's largest military power, had artillery grenades for 1 week of Ukrainian consumption. US production before the war was 15,000 artillery rounds a month. That's 180,000 a year. Russian expenditure the first year is around 10 million artillery shells. So the scale of this is my kind of main point that I really want to drive home, is that it's, our artillery systems are great, but 40 is not that much. But also scale. Justin touched upon air defenses. Everyone's asking, where's the Russian Air Force in this war? Why are they so bad at SIA-DIAD, suppression or destruction of enemy air defenses? as a colleague says, well, it's because NATO forgot to buy the air defense systems. That has not been a dimensioning threat for the Russian VKS because we've had quite few of them. They haven't needed to thought about it that deeply, whereas Ukraine, very cleverly, bought a hell of a lot of SAM, which has kept the Russian Air Force largely at bay. That is a lesson that is much more important than looking at fancy strike from TB2 drones. I think it was you even told me that most of the videos we kept seeing all spring of TB2 UAVs exploding Russian armor was filmed within the first 10 days, because then the order was that anything that flies, it's ours. That's the reason why you could actually take a quite slow-moving drone and explode a Russian air defense system. But Ukraine very cleverly published those throughout the spring, which generated popular support, crowdfunding, and TB2 providing more of those. But since then, they have not been an important capability in this war. It led a lot of speculation to now the tank is dead because we got javelins and we got TB2, so no one will ever want to use a tank anymore. Facts on the ground suggest to the opposite, that the tank is quite a good combination of armor, firepower, and movement still. So that's kind of my major part, and I think that also ties into what is Russia's best strategy at this point. Western countries has front-loaded Ukraine with material ammunition for this offensive. One of the reasons why it's even possible is because US plundered their ammo depots in Israel, in South Korea, just to get ammunition for this offensive. And then it's a bit of a wait and see. If it goes well, then maybe we support more. It's not a great way to run an offensive, because the communication to the Russian side is quite clear. It's like, okay, we'll just withstand this counteroffensive, and then Ukraine will be out of capability. So all incentives is, even if it's going really badly, it's just hang in there, because sooner or later they'll run out of their capabilities. And then in the period after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, until Western production has really kicked in and you have significant new material, you have a window of opportunity where Russia will be relatively stronger. So that's one of the things that worries me the most, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Both of you, you really emphasize the scale of what needs to be done, and the size of the investments. When you see the response so far that has happened around in Europe and amongst NATO allies and partners and invitees, do you see tendencies? Is what you're asking for, is it happening?
Short answer, no.
No.
Why not? And what's happening instead?
The UK, for example, has been spending a lot of money up front, but it's been broadly spending that money buying capability around the world from often some quite non-traditional sources and sending it to Ukraine. So there's been a lot of investment in ammunition procurement and system procurement, but it's been less about investment in long-term production capacity, because fundamentally, I think there was, at least until quite recently, still a hope among a lot of political classes that this would be over quite soon. That especially actually after the stunning display of maneuver success with the Kharkiv offensive, there's a kind of hope of, well, if Ukraine can just do that once or twice more, then the Russians will fall apart and it'll be fine. And I think one of the things we've seen since then is, first of all, the Russian mobilization has worked to the extent that there are no longer large sections of the line that have very few people in them, and bodies in trenches, as long as they're dug in deep enough, are still very hard to dig out. The fundamental problem for the Ukrainian counteroffensive is you can get through minefields safely by going slowly, and you can get under an artillery barrage by going quickly. You can't do both at the same time, demonstrably. And also, there are just harder trade-offs to be made when you're on the offensive, because, for example, if you're pushing your armor through a gap, A, the enemy knows exactly where it is, but B, do you push up your very valuable short and medium range air defense systems to provide cover against those, to provide cover for those assets moving forward against Russian helicopter gunships in particular, but also potentially Russian fast jets? If you push them forward, the risk is that, yes, they'll provide some anti-air cover, but they'll then be taken out by anti-tank fire and by artillery, and those are key assets for defending the front line. So it is much, much easier to defend than to attack. in this war. And so while Ukraine has been extremely good, in the defense, particularly small unit tactics have been very innovative, very impressive. And of course, the morale factor is hugely in Ukraine's favor. Ukrainian soldiers are very motivated. They've been more inconsistent on the attack just because there are relatively few units. They've had to grow their military massively since February last year, and so there are relatively few units where there is enough core mass of personnel who can run a high-level orders process, because a lot of these people were civilians, maybe with some prior military experience, but civilians, a year and a half ago, and it just takes time to train that expertise. So, yeah, the investment is patchy in Europe. In America, we've seen very, very promising investment. They've put several tens of billions of dollars into ammunition production facilities, but that will deliver results in terms of massively increased production about the beginning of 2025, just because it takes time to build factories. And that's mainly for restocking their own needs, and they also need to beef up defenses in Taiwan and elsewhere, so it's hard.
Oscar, I will ask you about the Swedish perspective on this. I mean, we see... we're in the midst of a rather massive rearmament, and now there's a debate on where sort of that focus should be. I mean, where do you see that focus being led, and is it the right one, or?
Well, we'll see.
Question.
I mean, I think that's one of the problems with the Swedish approach, because we're in the middle of a big defense commission investigation that will lead to a new defense bill in 1.5 years' time. Which is great, which is a classic Swedish thing. You sit for a long while and then you think about things. Poland bought a couple of hundred of HIMARS systems directly. Whereas in 1.5 years, when Sweden thinks, oh, actually, we need rocket artillery. How many HIMARS will there be on the market? If Poland realizes, okay, maybe we bought 60 systems too much, I think they'll have a good position in selling those HIMARS systems further. That inactivity kind of bugs me a little bit, to be honest, in this congregation. So I think that there are some things which we obviously need. And I mean, we talked about air defense missiles and the mass needed. We talked about artillery and the mass needed of that. So I think that there should be, first of all, I think the most important part is kind of urgently start shopping around things that are fairly likely to need. You don't need to do the 1.5 years really deep analysis to see some of the needs that we do. I've argued long beforehand we should just build a cruise missile factory and have a couple of thousand of them on our amphibious boats, on our trucks, and on our fighter jets. But who's listening to me anyways? But in terms of the balance, I mean, that is hard. That is not yet to be seen, because the armed forces are still in a transition, moving from what was essentially from 2004 expeditionary defense, put it into a national defense perspective, and then try to actually build it a little bit more. But kind of the rough organization and shape of it is still mostly formed by the expeditionary era. It is not set up like, hey, this is what we actually need for new reality. And that reality will shift massively if and when we join NATO. Because then we also can give away with the assumptions that guided Swedish defense, was that because we don't have any firm guarantees, we need to build our own forces to fight as if we were alone, which gives you one set of answers to the problem set, whereas now we can do things with our neighbors. We will need vastly different capabilities. I'll stop there. I can be more specific, but I'll stop there.
I will actually pick up on that. And, well, you mentioned... if and when Sweden joins NATO, I mean, we talk now about lessons from Ukraine, what we can learn, what the West can learn, with the risk of sounding, very like we can teach the world too much of a lesson. But is there, in fact, I mean, some lessons that Sweden can bring to NATO when it comes to our defense planning and our defense industry? We have a rather significant defense industry. We have some history of preparing for war with Russia. We have our own fighter jets that are specifically designed for this. I mean, what could Sweden bring to NATO in this context when preparing for the Russian threat?
So from an outside perspective, observing the Swedish Defence Forces, particularly the Air Force, there's a lot of good stuff to learn. A lot of it is about actually the practical approach to risk, the way that risk and uncertainty are managed, and the way that experienced personnel are mixed very effectively with conscripts with not very much training on quite technical tasks, aircraft servicing, for example, because it's just a very practical and successful approach that enables Sweden to get quite a lot out of a relatively meager defence budget in terms of the mass that can be deployed. I think also there's a lot to be said for Sweden's approach of at least in the fighter force, where I've seen in some depth, taking quite a slow, methodical approach to building and training expertise. So in most NATO air forces, for example, you have 3-year tours. So a pilot will do 3 years in a tour. They might go and do another 3-year tour at a different squadron, or they might go and do a ground job for 3 years and they come back and do another 3 years in a different squadron, do another ground job, maybe come back as a squadron leader. Whereas in Sweden, you join a wing and you expect it to be there for 20, 25 years. And you sit and train to, first of all, air-to-air, but then your wing's specialization. And you do that for 20 years and you become incredibly good at that thing. And given that level of focus, that not being massively expeditionary at the time when these training TTPs and doctrine were being written, that's a very attractive thing for a lot of air forces and enables Sweden to have depth of expertise in its front line on key mission sets that most air forces its size wouldn't be able to match. So I think there's a lot to be said on that. Obviously, dispersal is a difficult skill. Sweden understands that better than most people because they're better at it. And therefore, interestingly, the perspective from a lot of air forces visiting the Swedish Air Forces, my God, this is amazing what they're able to do. It's certainly very impressive for me. But then the Swedish Air Force perspective is, God, we've forgotten everything. We're so terrible at this. We've got a mountain to climb to get back to where we are. And of course, they're both right. So it's there's also, I think, a lot to learn in terms of, or there's probably a message for NATO in terms of, and Sweden as it hopefully joins soon. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is the British saying. In getting integrated into NATO tactics, techniques and procedures, into NATO STANAGs, etc. Most of your kit is already interoperable. And I think there may be a quite Scandinavian instinct, same in Finland, to comply with the exact written letter of every single rule and regulation in order to show that you're good allies, even if that means bending your force out of shape. What I would say is, for example, the French are still great NATO allies and in a lot of cases just kind of gloss over some of the less convenient bits of the regulation as far as their own strategic priorities go. There is room for trying to make representation where there are elements of your military culture and force laydown that should be preserved, because largely the reason the alliance is delighted to have you in, stand fast Istanbul for now, is because A, where you are, and B, that you're good at what you do. It's not that we want you to suddenly come and become a UK at 20% scale. That's not the ask.
What do you think, Oscar? What can we bring to the table when we are around the table? Or
yes.
Once we are around the table?
No, I think there's a number of things. Not saying that only as a Swede, but objectively, and I think that part of it has to do with defense industry. I think Jonsson has made a case very eloquently why the Gripen is kind of made for the task of what Ukraine is facing right now. It has also to do not only with the kit, it has to do with the basing concept, dispersal concept, which is also, the Gripen is made with that in mind, living within shooting range from Russian missiles. How do you survive them? But besides our defense industry, which is already very integrated with NATO member states, our geography is the most obvious one. Like, you cannot defend the Baltic states, for instance, without using Swedish territory. You probably could have accessed Swedish territory anyways, but if Sweden is a NATO member, you can actually plan for it. You can build out your runways so you can land the right aircrafts, and you can also start doing proper planning how such a contingency would do. The Nordic dimension there is also very interesting. Finnish Air Force should probably base in Sweden in a contingency with Russia, and Swedish units could probably base in Finland or in the Baltic states. And the third part, of course, is the intelligence aspect. We already have deep intelligence cooperation with, in particular, the US, which could benefit NATO, even though there are some problems with NATO intelligence sharing. But I do think that Sweden will undoubtedly give a lot to the alliance.
Thank you. All right. With that, we have a couple of minutes to open up for questions and brief comments from the audience. And we have one gentleman in the back. Please introduce yourself. First, wait for the microphone.
Jonathan Feldman, Stockholm University, International Relations. So my question is there any space for diplomacy, or is just assume you're going to defeat the Russians? It doesn't seem the Russians are willing to give up unless you have something to offer them, because there was not an anti-war coup, there was sort of a militarist one. And I'm wondering if there's any limits to military power. And then finally, is the security dilemma dead? Thank you.
So I'll have a go at the first bits, and then I'll hand over to Oscar for more sensible words, but also on the security dilemma. I think I'm not enough of a theorist to know what that means. So on room for diplomacy, I think we need to be very clear about how diplomacy works between states that are at war. We have had our mindset on peace negotiations and their relationship with ongoing conflict completely warped by 25 years of counterinsurgency operations, where fundamentally the question on when the war ended was, when did we, as the American-led coalition, decide that it was just not going to work? We'll admit it to ourselves, and how much do we want to sacrifice to get a messy deal to end a war that is just not going to be won? Because fundamentally the war would go on until we decided to give up, because we could sustain the effort, and we were fighting an insurgent force that didn't control a country. That is just not the way that negotiations between warring states work, especially in the case of Russia, where there is no way to defeat Russia on the battlefield as a country in the way that previous all-out wars have been decided because of the nuclear element. You can't take Moscow. So fundamentally, the war will end in terms of a negotiated peace settlement or ceasefire when the Russians believe that and when the Russians legitimately actually in their own minds believe, rather than say, that they stand to lose more by continuing fighting than by agreeing to peace and freezing things as they are. So for a start, you don't go into negotiations talking about what Kyiv might need to give up. You go into negotiations about what we are going to ask the Russians to give up in exchange for peace, because there are going to be mutual concessions. If you start teeing up negotiations around, well, what might we force Kyiv, because that's the underlying essential assumption set on what might Kyiv need to give up. What you mean is, what might we force them to give up by withholding support conditionally to try and end a war because we're tired of it? What that tells the Russians is they just need to hold out, and that over time the West will give up. Their current strategy is literally to avoid losing the war until the West gets tired. And interestingly, if you look at the deterrence implications of us agreeing to or forcing some sort of quote-unquote peace under that circumstance, it would actually mean that they had defeated NATO, industrially and politically. Yes, not on the battlefield, but at this point, the alliance is pretty all in on supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. So if we essentially force them to make loads of concessions in exchange for peace negotiations, and then more concessions in exchange for some sort of ceasefire, what the signal will be sent is A, to the Russians, B, to the Chinese, that the West doesn't have the stomach, even though it has all the money and all the industry, for a long-term fight. So that's a terrible signal for long-term peace. But also, it will just give the Russians 6 months to reset their military, get back in position, get their industrial position back out, and then go straight back in. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians will be left with everybody in the West going, oh, thank God that's over. We can slack off on all this very expensive military support. And so 6 months down the line, you'll have a renewed Russian offensive from a much better positioned Russian army against the weaker Ukraine that's probably facing political questions internally as well, because right now there's a huge amount of unity as long as the fighting goes. So basically, we have to break the Russians militarily in Ukraine before they will agree to any sort of meaningful holding ceasefire, because otherwise, what's their incentive to have any peace? They manifestly do not care about the lives of their soldiers, let alone the destruction in Ukraine. So unfortunately, we're in this for the long haul until the Russians realize they're going to lose militarily, and that's the point when they might agree to some sort of meaningful negotiation.
Thank you, Justin. Oscar, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would. No, I think it's an interesting misconception that there is no diplomacy or haven't been any attempts of diplomacy. Like Western states did nothing but try to negotiate the way out of this. I mean, the Russian statement in mid-December was basically, the middle finger to NATO, say, hey, NATO, go dismantle yourself. And champagne bottles were popped in Moscow. And I mean, up until you can watch the documentary when Macron called Putin and is sitting there and incredibly naively believed that there was still some kind of negotiating, room, whereas the Russian leadership were hell-bent on invading Ukraine and were taking the piss out of him. I mean, Putin said, no, we'll have a meeting in Geneva, talk to my foreign policy advisor, Ushakov. And then they called him Ushakov the day after. He's like, no, the president didn't say anything about the Geneva meeting. So I think I have no idea where this conception comes from that there was no diplomacy from the West and that there are no diplomacy. If there was anything relevant to talk about, there would be talks about it. If diplomacy equals we should force Ukraine to give up something which they are entitled to by international law or by morality or anything, that's not really diplomacy. That's kind of just giving in to an aggressor and rewarding that. And my analysis is the same with Justin's. What is the limit to the use of force? I think there's great limits to the use of force. You don't do very much with force. You blow up things and kills people, and you hope to try to persuade things with that destructive power. And it's really hard. Especially when you use it, it's really hard to get your political goals there. And I think that, I think Russia is one state to realize that. Has the security dilemma died? No, I think security dilemma is a great concept, but I think it's the wrong one for this one. I don't think that Russian readings of Ukraine was in any way they are going to invade us or NATO are going to invade us. They saw Russia losing their influence in Ukraine, which they felt entitled to by themselves, not by international law or anything kind of else, and they decided to act because of that. That was not because NATO was threatening Russia or Ukraine was threatening Russia. That was because Russia believes they have the right to dominate Ukraine and are willing to go to lengths to achieve that. But I think the security dilemma is a great construct.
And what is it for those of us who don't know what it is?
Okay, no.
Like in 20 seconds.
State A feels insecure, therefore increases its military capability. State B sees an increase in State A's military capability. This is scary. I'm increasing my military capability. Right. And then State A seeing, look, State B is increasing their military. This is scary. We need to...
Okay. Thank you. Now we had a bit of filling in our gap of knowledge in international relations also, so I thank you for that. Do we have more questions? We have time for one more, a brief one, perhaps. Or anyone outside who feels eager to put a question? Yes, please, Anders. There's another microphone that works better.
So, given everything you've seen in Ukraine, the battlefield, and the discussions of bringing new capabilities in from the West, is there in your mind any sort of Wunderwaffe that would really turn or much quicker change the outcome of the war and the final defeat of the Russians?
Sadly, the Wunderwaffe that can end a war just by existing are called nuclear weapons, and the Russians have a lot of them, so it's probably not a viable or a smart way to go. There is a tremendous, I think, overuse of concepts that essentially boil down to a silver bullet or a Wunderwaffe. No one weapon system is going to solve this war, and this is one of the areas where I think the fighter debate has really gone off the rails, because in order to try and politically convince Western partners, particularly the US, to provide fighter aircraft, Ukraine has had to make claims for what they will achieve, which are simply not supported in reality. And in fact, also lots of advocates for air power, in particularly America, have also made those same claims about what fighter aircraft, F-16 in particular, could achieve. You know, basically give them this and then they'll win the war. It's just a fantasy. It doesn't exist. And so, for example, if you take HIMARS, which is probably the closest thing to a Wunderwaffe in terms of one weapon system that has had a disproportionate outsized effect on the strategic balance of the war, that had an incredibly important effect for about 2 months. So it was critical when it was introduced in late July, August last year, because it forced the Russians to disperse their massive artillery ammunition dumps next to their gun lines in the Donbass. Their strategy at that time relied on them firing between 30,000 and 60,000 rounds a day at individual Ukrainian positions and simply, you know, erasing them one at a time to take ground. And Ukraine really, with all the electronic warfare equipment as well, concentrated around that one small bit of advance. Ukraine really didn't have many options. And so they took huge losses trying to stem that. The HIMARS effect was to force them to disperse that ammunition logistics chain, and they've dispersed it very well. HIMARS really isn't that effective anymore. It's still a useful component of the Ukrainian armed capabilities, but it's no longer having those sort of effects. Those lasted about a month and a half. But what it did was force the Russians to adopt a more dispersed, therefore less efficient, command and control and artillery logistics system. What you've seen, for example, with limited numbers of British Storm Shadow being supplied recently, which is once more extending that range beyond the roughly 75 kilometers of HIMARS, is you've forced them to further disperse what is now in another range bracket. Because if they have big command and control centers or big ammunition dumps, that's an obvious invitation for low numbers of very high-end strike capabilities there. But again, it's not going to win the war. It's just further degrading a level of efficiency that's there in the Russian system. The one thing I would say that could make a serious difference in terms of buying out risk, not in terms of winning Ukraine the war on its terms, but buying out risk that Ukraine ever loses, is a fighter capability that can be dispersed on the ground, so can use enough bases with a viable maintenance system to avoid being easily targeted by cruise missiles, and that has a long-range enough missile to, even though it will be low and slow relative to the Russians because of their ground-based air defenses, to keep the Russian Air Force with their long-range, high-altitude launch missiles back. If you can supply that, something like, I don't know, a Gripen with Meteor, then that could have an enormous effect, even if you had quite a small number of aircraft, but it would be a defensive effect in terms of you're buying out a major risk. It's not going to win the war.
Thank you very much, Justin. And just short 20 seconds, Oscar.
No, and sorry to repeat myself, but I think the Wunderwaffe is scale. I mean, if we look at the Storm Shadow, I have no idea how many the UK has supplied. 30, 40, 50. I mean, Russia has launched around 3,000 long-range precision missiles. 200 Leopards are being sent. Russia has visually lost around 1,600 tanks. So, like, the Leopard is not a Wunderwaffe, and the Storm Shadow is not a Wunderwaffe. It's about scale.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I would very much like to thank you, Justin Bronk and Oscar Jonsson, for participating. Thank you to the audience, Your Excellency, and to Saab for organizing this. A big round of applause for everyone.